Hi, everyone, and welcome to this UK and a Changing Euro lunch hour on Trump, trade, and tariffs. Excellent timing, Sam. Logging on just in time. Well done, you. We've got a fantastic panel today to talk about all the issues connected with trade and Donald Trump. Monica Gorman is a managing director of Crowell Global Advisors and was a staffer in Joe Biden's White House. Uh, Sam Flint, I was going to say. Oh my God. Sam Lowe is a partner at Flint Global and is a general trade nerd. For those of you who don't, let me encourage you very strongly to subscribe to his newsletter called Most Favored Nation, which includes some of the best felt tip illustrations of trade you will ever see in your whole life. I thought the one today was fantastic, by the way. Sam, Mona Paulsen is an assistant professor of law at the LSE. And last but not least, our own Sarah Hall from the University of Cambridge, who's a deputy director of UK and a Changing Europe. So, as ever, stick your questions in the Slido, stick your votes in the Slido. There's already a question that says, please explain the president's reasoning. So that could tax us. Stick your votes in the Slido for the questions you want me to ask. But let's just start off, as we always do, with a bit of a softball one. Incidentally, for those of you who are surprised, let me just say, what a time to be alive. But I'm not allowed to talk about the football. Thank you for that, Jack Kessler, for the first question of the day, which was that. But what have you made of what's happened so far? I mean, you all follow trade. You all look a little bit sleep deprived as a result. But, just the initial sort of big picture thoughts. Did you expect it to be like this before the inauguration, for instance? Mona, I'm going to start with you.
Pressure. So I would say that I did not expect it to be this much. We sort of went from uh, sort of having expectations about what we thought the first Trump administration's trade policy would look like to, I think, an avalanche of aggressive sort of trade policies and actions that sort of hit one after another, sometimes several times a day. We also saw a complete policy reversal from the Biden administration. I know Monica's here, so she can speak to that more in terms of a strategy that was very industrial policy focused and on building domestic manufacturing innovation to a strategy that really focused on insulating through extensive uses of tariffs and the widest possible scope of US domestic laws to be able to facilitate that, justified by questions of security, emergency, frankly, anything under the executive discretion that they so chose. And it's constantly evolving and pushing back and pausing. So there's no break or relief, really. You're just constantly on this train that keeps going. So that's my reflections on what we've seen from not even the first 100 days of the Trump administration. I'll
I'm
pause.
very relaxed about this becoming a trade policy therapy session for you all. But Monica,
So it's a more aggressive approach than expected, but I would say it's not inconsistent with what I would have thought. And if you think about where we were in the first Trump administration, we've seen a bit of a sort of a thread all the way through, including with the Biden administration. So really pre-2017, you had the consensus on free trade and global trading agreements, and that really switched with the first Trump administration. It was much more measured. And I think that reflects a lot of differences in the advisors in the president's first term. But that consensus around free trade is not working. We need to remedy some of the challenges of free trade and the problems that it has wrought. That we did see in Trump 1. And we actually saw that carried through with Biden. Biden didn't reverse the 301s. He may have narrowed them and made them a little bit more specific. But this idea of using tariffs to correct some of the challenges caused by trade definitely were there in the Biden administration as well. And then in Trump 2, we're really seeing that carry through. It's just much more aggressive and accelerated. And again, I think that reflects the constellation of advisors now around the president. Fewer of those voices saying, let's look at what's going on in the market, and more of, okay, tariffs are what we need here. So again, consistent thread, maybe more aggressive than expected, but a consistent thread.
and I
Can
have
I
to say, I
add?
remember.
Sorry,
Go on,
sorry.
go on, Mona.
I was just going to say that the other, just to build with what Monica said, the one thing that hit me also is that we're seeing a much wider scope. So in Trump 2.0, we're seeing a lot more emphasis on a broader sense of what constitutes economic security. Whereas before in the first administration, we saw sort of classic issues like steel and aluminum, autos being sort of the key areas to be protected, where now we're seeing a much broader scope where everything is sort of coming under this purview. We actually don't know how far it's going to go. So we have notification of possible on pharmaceuticals, on all sorts of legacy and new types of semiconductors, which are for all sorts of uses in everything from cars to AI, but also in things like lumber and, you know, sort of regular civilian uses of lumber. And this is directed specifically at the Canadians. So that's the other interesting aspect, is that we're seeing a lot more coming under the scope of tariffs, I think, than we saw before.
Sam?
I mean, one of the things you can never say as a consultant is that you were surprised by something, right? Because it suggests that you you didn't do your job very well. But I think the volume has been something that, I mean, people just largely unprepared for. But in terms of what was the expectation was and still is that the aggregate tariff level of the US by the end of this presidency will be higher than it was at the beginning. Insofar as the assumption was that there was going to be tariffs, there's a question as to how they would be deployed, on what justification and on what timelines. And I think one of the justifications for the tariffs, though, that is slightly different from the first administration, where you did have the coercive use of tariffs, where you did have this sort of obsession with using tariffs to generate domestic production and incentivize companies to move investment from outside the US to inside the US, is the revenue raising function under the new administration, whereby it just adds in this slightly new dynamic, even in the context of third countries negotiating with the US, where you have to assume that no one, or maybe a single country could do it, but on aggregate, you can't negotiate away the new tariffs entirely, because they've got them bookmarked as a revenue raising tool to offset other policy measures in the by which I mean tax cuts. So I think that's a slightly different dimension that just wasn't really. It's not that no one ever mentioned that tariffs could raise money in the first administration, but it didn't seem so central.
Okay, Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, it's hard going last on this one, but I mean, I agree with that answers there. That I think that for me, it's the like dynamic nature of the policies that are emerging and the depth and density of them, which has been more surprising than the kind of use of tariffs as a kind of economic policy tool in a different way. I think, though, there are kind of two areas where if you take a step back from the kind of almost daily changes, there's some interesting questions which I didn't fully anticipate. One is around what this means for like how we understand globalization and the sort of challenges that this poses to how, you know, orthodox understandings of why countries trade, how global supply chains work. That I think those kind of longer term questions are really interesting and often get missed, I think, in the kind of, oh gosh, what's happening today or even this afternoon. And I think the other area which I find quite interesting is how other aspects of the state are becoming enrolled in it. I'm thinking particularly around the kind of relationship with the Fed, for example, and how other areas of economic policy activity that you wouldn't immediately associate with the kind of sphere of tariffs are becoming enrolled in this kind of policy making machine. So for me, it's those kind of wider questions and implications that I find quite interesting.
And on that first wider question in particular, I think as social scientists, we should be profoundly grateful to both President Trump and indeed the Brexiters for carrying out what are essentially a series of natural experiments, answering questions we've been arguing about for decades. You know, what happens if you suddenly fiddle with your immigration system or whack tariffs on things? Oh, we're going to find out, aren't we? We're going to have some evidence now for some of the claims we've made in the past. But I mean,
although the US is an interesting case study on this, right? Insofar as the US is slightly anomalous in terms of how it interacts with the rest of the world in the context of global trade, insofar as a proportion of its total economy. Trade isn't that important. If you just look imports plus exports at a proportion of GDP, it's around 20% or so. Like the UK is around 60%, just as a comparator. So there's a slight question mark as to how far the US can push it in the sort of we're just going to mess things up. And it's not going to hit us too hard. And I think this last administration was the sort of fiddling around at the edges. Maybe this is the one where they're really pushing that to its but it's
No,
mad.
no, absolutely. And we'll come back to, whether this can actually work in any sense. I was very struck by the Adam Posen piece in Foreign Affairs about US China and what it might mean, but we'll come back to that. But I mean, we can't tiptoe around the fact that we're going to have to at some point, and let's do it now, talk about, and we've touched on it, and Sam's touched on it, why the president's doing what he's doing. I mean, some people say it's because of the revenue raising. Others say it's because, he's being influenced by lots of people around him and who see this as their interest, though there seems to be an equal number of people who don't see it as in their interests around him. Others say, it's to get concessions in other areas. It might be defense spending. It might be whatever. It might just be general kowtowing to the president in terms of, golf course permits or whatever. But if you had, just from what you know, and I understand that no one knows much about this, and I said to you, rank in order the top 3 reasons why you think the president is doing what he's doing, what would you do? We always like to simplify, Sam. It's always got to be a list, and it's always got to be simple.
So my number one, when it comes to him, and I'm looking forward to everyone disagreeing with me, is that he wants companies that sell to US consumers to make those products in the United States, and he thinks tariffs is a way of achieving that. I mean, it just feels like it's been a consistent thread. The point I would make, though, is that on any given day, some of the other priorities you're mentioning could be higher or lower, just based on how he's feeling at the time. Because the one you didn't mention is that someone in another country has said something mean about him.
Yeah.
Right. Or done something to annoy him. And that can quickly go to the top of the list in terms of, we're going to threaten you with tariffs because, you're not very nice to me. But I think the idea that tariffs are a tool to pull in investment and the like is fairly consistent. And then the other one is that coercion in the context of addressing what he perceives to be unfair trade barriers abroad, whereby tariffs are a useful threat. I mean, I'll leave it to Monica to comment on the sort of merits of this argument, but an outside observation is that tariffs are also a tool he can use quite freely compared to other mechanisms of the state, in that it's, we've seen from all the executive orders, he's sort of, if he wants to do something quickly, tariff seems to be the easy answer, whereas lots of other measures would require dealing with Congress and long legislative processes. So I think the expediency also has some appeal.
Monica, let's come to you on the big question, but also on the legal question then. So why is he doing what he's doing, and what chances are that any of this might be overturned by courts at some point?
Yeah, so I agree with Sam, but I would put a different spin on it, which is that I think this is something Donald Trump truly believes in. He has been very consistent from decades ago talking about the role of tariffs, the importance of tariffs. He believes in tariffs. And I think he does believe it as a way to drive US industrial policy. So in terms of why, I agree with Sam. I think it's because it's something he can do. Over the decades, Congress has delegated a lot of authority on tariffs back to the executive, so it is something that he can do. When it comes to Section 232 tariffs, as we're seeing on investigations on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, we've already seen in some other areas, that consistently, when challenges have been brought, and we have challenges from the first Trump administration, the executive has been successful. Those challenges have failed. So I think particularly on Section 301, Section 232, Section 201, if those are invoked, there is a good track record of the executive being able to take these actions. What is going to be interesting is the recent challenges under the IEEPA statute. So that's the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. Tariffs have never been used as part of IEEPA. This is a novel use of that statute. We have now seen some significant challenges brought. That is where I think if we're going to see successful court challenges and the executive's authority curbed, it is going to be under this novel use of the IEEPA statute.
Can you just explain IEEPA and the statute?
Sure. So it's a law dating back to the 1970s. It allows the president to take emergency actions in the economic realm if the national security of the United States is threatened. And so in this case, the president declared that the trade imbalance is a national emergency, and therefore he needed to take these actions. But again, that was not necessarily, folks can argue how IEEPA was envisioned, that it would be utilized, certainly with tariffs on this broad of a scale. And so again, we're going to see court challenges, and that is not surprising.
Mona.
Yeah, I think one of the key elements that we haven't talked about yet, but that forms part of the Trump administration's calculus and thinking about its strategy that hasn't been mentioned yet is China. Now, it's a little inconsistent in terms of understanding what the goals are, whether in terms of what Sam mentioned in having actual Chinese firms come and produce and build things in the United States, in tension with security concerns of what that means for having China and Chinese firms engage within the United States as far as security controls. So it's unclear yet where that will go, but certainly the tensions between the United States and China in terms of supply chain dependencies that were really evident in the first Trump administration and certainly emphasized, or I suppose accelerated with the pandemic, have now led to the United States really seeking a part of that logic of onshoring is with respect to Chinese dependence. But it's also about securing the United States' technological domain or space in the future, and sort of also recognizing that the formation or fabrication of semiconductors and different technologies within the United States is important for the United States' future as an economic power. So ultimately, these are sort of the key ones. Now, of course, what we've seen as in comparison to the first Trump administration are massive tariffs, almost to the complete exclusion of Chinese goods. And the interesting thing about this is that you're seeing it in a lot of really new and innovative ways. So one is sort of taking away the de minimis, which was sort of a minimum amount that you could have where you could bring something in and you wouldn't have to go through the expensive paperwork. The costs really sort of outweighed the benefits of charging for certain small amounts, which fundamentally changes sort of fast fashion and how you bring in discrete single things into the United States. So from that all the way to cutting off China in terms of what they can trade with the United States. And this may go even further. But to understand the logic of why they do it, if we had seen the Trump administration as doing this as leverage for negotiation, that's sort of been blown out by the fact that these are maximum tariffs. And the Chinese have not said, oh, right, we'll come to the table and we'll negotiate with you. They have hit back in equal terms just as hard. So we've had a real ratcheting of a trade war between the United States and China. And it's unclear whether they're going to do anything. We also see the United States just in, I think, over the past few weeks saying, if you negotiate with China, you do so at a detriment to negotiating with us. So therefore, it's actually sort of pitting other governments against China. And we don't know what the outcome of that will be. We don't know for sure that governments will say, oh, right, we'll automatically align with the United States in this. They may actually find greater benefit or cause to negotiate with China. And of course, this is on top of China's extensive through Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure development that they've been slowly doing for the past 20 years. So it's a real complex situation that's magnified by the trade policy, but also other things in terms of international development that are coming at a head, making it unclear what the logic is.
And we hear that already from some European states in terms of the language about China. I mean, nothing's been done, but you hear people saying, should we be moving closer to China? Sarah, I'm going to spare you from going last again. I'll come to you in a sec about something. But just Sam, on what you were saying, I mean, it strikes me as odd if the aim is to drive sort of manufacturers to move to the United States, that as I understand it, there's an exemption for tariffs on smartphones coming from China, where I suppose conceivably in sort of those kind of areas, the US might want to nick a bit of the market. Whereas in a lot of areas where the US simply can't even aspire to replace the Chinese, those tariffs are there. So it's massively inconsistent at best, isn't it?
But the uncertainty also is a driver of decision making, right? So insofar as if you are constantly faced with this situation where you do not know from a day-to-day basis whether you're going to be able to service the US market from China, for example, or from another economy. And it might be okay now, but maybe tomorrow that changes. One of the things you could do if you've got the capital, the ability to do so, there's the workforce available in the US, is set up a manufacturing site within the US that largely tries to source from the US or at least neighboring countries, which has its own issues, but better than nothing, in order to sell to your US consumer base. And if you can do that, and it's such a huge if, you potentially remove yourself from this discussion, or at least it becomes a sort of, a fifth agenda item rather on your sort of board agenda rather than number one. But the timeframes involved means you probably can't do that overnight. And lots of companies just can't do that because there's one of the reasons people produce abroad is, of course, labor cost arbitrage. But then there's also specialism. There's labor force. There's access to local resources. So there's reasons you do things outside of the US, and it does become hugely challenging. And to Mona's point about China, just to say there is a logic behind threatening other countries in terms of saying if you want as Vietnam to remove this really high reciprocal tariff permanently, you need to put restrictions on Chinese trade and investment coming into Vietnam, is to prevent circumvention. Because the obvious thing that's going to happen post putting huge tariffs on China, and this has already happened in lots of other areas, and it's been part of the conversation with Mexico, Canada, and others, is you get Chinese firms either circumventing, so sending products to the US via other countries, or investing in those countries to sell into the US. And if you're just trying to hit China, you have to stop that from happening as well. So actually it's us or them does have a logic behind it beyond just we don't like China.
I mean, is there anyone who's willing to sort of just give a quick summary of what's happening with Canada and Mexico? Because I mean, with Mexico in particular, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you have seen this increase in Chinese investment since about 2019, and stuff that's USMCA compliant escapes the tariffs, as far as I understand it. So, where are we as of now? I'm sorry, I mean it's a nightmare question to ask.
I'm Canadian, so I'll take that one.
Okay.
Not good, I would say, is my quick summary for you. It's not good. And
That's
I think
the sort of tagline we like.
Yeah, I think it's not good. The Mexicans and the Canadians are actually in different situations. So Mexico is in a situation where, per Sam's point, it was identified by the IMF as one of the intermediary companies or countries with China. So that was a key issue that the Trump administration had to deal with in terms of dealing with Mexico and sort of the initial draft of tariffs that came out after the inauguration. For Canada, we're in a very different situation. We're in the heat of an election, which is next week, next Monday. We have seen immediate threats to Canadian sovereignty, which ultimately completely changed the game for Canadians. So they're approaching this trade war really as also a battle in terms of territorial integrity, which is a really different calculus or element to this. So you have centuries of close relations with the United States as the close sort of ally on the border, which is really within Canada being seen differently. This has led the Canadians to actually take on some different initiatives. One is internal trade improvements, particularly with non-tariff barriers that were existing between the provinces. The other really interesting thing that came out of it is that the actual premiers of the different provinces began vocalizing retaliation upon the Trump administration for their actions, which was really interesting to see, to the point where they had to sort of after the fact come up with regulation to be able to do what they said they were going to do on television, which was really, really new. So one was the Ontario exports for energy. You then saw regulation being drafted specifically for that purpose because it wasn't within the law itself. So in terms of what was supposed to be a USMCA renegotiation in 2026, I don't know what the future of that will be. One, we have to see who the prime minister will be. But if it's a liberal, if it's Carney, then you can imagine some sort of negotiation will happen. But it's this sort of new added element also in that threat that's I think on many Canadians' minds, this threat of sort of becoming the next state of the United States when it's not welcome, at least based on sort of polling that we've seen from Canada. That adds a new element. And whereas with the Canadians were really on board with some of the Biden administration's concerns with respect to connected cars and the development of electric vehicles, I don't think we'll see that kind of immediate alignment that we saw before. I think that will be a shift.
And I'll just stick with you on this, Mona, as the resident Canadian. But is this
Canadian British now?
is this forever? I mean, are we seeing things happening in Canada?
We never forget. We're so polite. No, I mean, ultimately, it is in our best interest to maintain an open economy. And Canada, unlike what Sam was saying in terms of U.S. reliance on trade, the Canadians are a trading country. And have always been. And so I think the other interesting element of this is that they have to walk this very narrow line where they have to immediately respond to the United States while also adhering to international commitments. And so therefore, they're in this really delicate space where they're trying to bring complaints to the WTO, to have consultations, while also sort of undertaking immediate responses through their domestic laws. And that's a difficult one to do. And ultimately, if we want as best we can to get out of that. But as we were saying before, we don't know what this means. I think the Canadians are going to begin building stronger defense, which you've seen Carney say he's going to improve the Canadian budget on defense significantly. And I think we're going to see the Canadians reach out more closely to their Trans-Pacific Partnership, to the TPP allies. I think they're going to look into South America. I think they're going to be looking abroad. They're going to be trying to improve their trade relations with everyone outside of the US relationship. I think that's in the medium term what we're going to see, my guess.
Okay, interesting. And Monica, is there a domestic constituency that this plays? I mean, I was sort of racking my brains thinking, because even US sort of manufacturers are getting hurt by this, aren't they? So is there a domestic constituency that likes this? And we'll come on to whether Trump actually cares about elections or public opinion in a minute. But is there a group who say, yay tariffs, let's have more?
Well, I think that's why you see the carve out for USMCA, because there's a domestic constituency to keep the USMCA
Right.
carve-outs intact. And I can't stress enough how integrated the supply chains are across the border. Automotive is the one we hear the most about. Parts of a car go back and forth across both borders multiple times before they are ultimately assembled in one of the three countries. But it's not just automotive. Medical device, a lot of the sterilization happens in Mexico. Agriculture, there are cows that cross the border so many times nobody knows exactly where they're from. Feed from one country goes down to another to feed animals that are then slaughtered and come back in as meat. So to set up borders between both countries is going to be incredibly detrimental to multiple businesses, multiple industries, and to the American consumer that would see prices rise immediately. So I think there's a significant amount of American self-interest in keeping that there. I agree with Mona. I don't know what this means for the renegotiation next year. But it's because of how supply chains are structured today, you simply cannot put up barriers on those borders without a significant amount of pain, including in the United States.
God, that was an answer that reminded me so much of Brexit,
I
especially
think,
about
Anand,
cows
as well, like
crossing
that
borders.
speaks to Sam's earlier point about, whether this is about repatriating manufacturing jobs to the US. And I think the key point there is that manufacturing jobs have fundamentally changed from what they looked like in the sort of 1970s and 80s, precisely because of the highly interconnected global value chains that is present day manufacturing. And so I think it's quite a romantic vision to think that you could use tariffs to repatriate manufacturing jobs and have a kind of made in the US, solely in the US product across a wide range of activities. So even if you're playing to that audience, I think there are real challenges because the nature of manufacturing has changed so fundamentally.
You can also argue, sorry, that USMCA, so this could be a deliberate outcome of what they've done, or it could be a byproduct. I'm not going to make a judgment on that. But USMCA has now become so much more valuable than it was before in terms of the preference margin, say for autos, has gone from, and by preference margin, I mean the difference between if you trade outside of the agreement or within it. So before Trump did all of this, for most autos, it was 2.5% on the final vehicle. He's now slapped in a massive tariff on goods that on autos that don't qualify for USMCA. So in a sense, you have to use USMCA now if you're trading between the three, if you're trading autos, because otherwise you've got all of these other additional tariffs, whereas USMCA excludes you. So USMCA is now really valuable, whereas before for autos, at least the final product, it wasn't necessarily that valuable. And in terms of pulling investment into the region, obviously he'll then want to renegotiate USMCA to make it even more biased towards the US, which is what I assume possibly happens next. There's a logic behind it, but there's a real risk I've just superimposed a whole load of logic onto something that's just incredibly messy.
I think the other element too of that is the future of electric vehicles, right? If we don't see a push towards electric vehicles from the United States, then it's this sort of question of whether the rest of the world will be developing electric cars and the infrastructure for that and battery power where it's not really developed in the US, and what that means for Canada and Mexico in terms of their own creation of that market. We don't really know what that will look like either.
Well, just on that, I'll come to you on this, Monica, but just bear in mind, Sam, in a minute, I'm going to say, can you explain to idiots like me what USMCA compliant actually means? Because that seems to me quite important. But just on this question about the United States, Monica, I mean, presumably California is going to keep its environmental regulations in place. California is going to keep pushing for high environmental standards for electric vehicles. And isn't that, I mean, we've seen the sort of the other two branches of the federal authorities not really putting up much opposition to Trump, but isn't that an area where you can see some pushback that might actually be effective because California is such a big market?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'll continue to see states regulate where they can, and it won't just be California. Other blue states will also make sure that their values are showing in their regulations, which will make it incredibly difficult for business to navigate because now they have to navigate 50 different regulatory environments instead of one. I do agree with Mona. I think the future of electric vehicles is going to be crucial. And a lot of this will depend on how the American automotive companies continue to innovate in this space. But if we see how rapidly BYD has innovated, how rapidly it has gained a foothold in multiple international markets in terms of electric vehicles, you can see which way the future is going when it comes to automotive technologies. And so I do think what happens in the United States is going to be a wild card. What American auto companies do they maintain those goals? That is going to continue to be a wild card in how fast the US, or if the US is able to keep up with these innovations.
Well, here's a top tip for free. The electric Ford Mustang should look more like the petrol Ford Mustang because the way it looks at the moment is just silly. Anyway, Sam, USMCA.
So in terms of what's compliance, I mean,
Yeah, because people say, oh, if things are USMCA, so
yeah,
if China builds a factory in Mexico,
yeah.
what would mean that works or what would mean that doesn't work?
Okay, so I'm glad you gave me a heads up. So I'm just going to give you a sort of summary of the USMCA rules of origin requirements for automotives. And
Oh
to
God,
take
what
a
have I
step back,
done? What have I done?
well, you asked. If you take a step back even further, when people say USMCA compliant or compliance with any free trade agreement, what they're talking about is whether the product meets the preferential rules of origin requirements of that agreement, which in summary means, is it local enough to the parties that are signed up to this agreement to be considered of one of those parties? So if I'm making a car in Mexico, is it actually a Mexican car or is it a Chinese car? And there's different provisions on a product specific basis to determine whether that matters. And for USMCA and motor vehicles, let me do this. USMCA raised the regional value content requirements to 75% for passenger vehicles compared to a lower value under NAFTA before. It also requires that at least 70% of the vehicles produced as steel and aluminium purchases originate in North America. And there's also some rules around the income levels of workers working on the vehicle for a certain proportion of it.
Okay.
In terms of how this applies in the context of the new tariffs, please correct me if I'm wrong because I've been getting muddled across all the different obligations. But if it's USMCA compliant, there's no tariff on the US content of the car, or have I confused this with one of the other? I'm looking at other people on the call.
Well, you're not looking at me, clearly.
No.
What is it you're asking?
Yeah,
If it's
so
USMCA compliant.
then the US content of the vehicle is not subject to the duty.
Yeah, the US content is within the reciprocal tariff strategy.
Yes, right.
The US.
Yeah, so then autos is separate. So USMCA compliant means it's not the duty doesn't apply. But it's a pretty, there were fair few companies that weren't USMCA compliant because it didn't matter. So they have had to think about this in the context of these duties and think about their local supply chain.
And for the USMCA prior to this too, it was this sort of, I mean, and Sam can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that the paperwork for figuring this out didn't happen. So now it's a huge cost for firms to have to actually navigate through that. And I mean, yes, it's not cows sort of dripping through and back, but heavily integrated, exactly what Monica said. And so being able to define USMCA compliant or even US content is sort of like my kid drawing a rainbow and then swirling it with all the paint and then asking me, okay, now can you go back and put the rainbow back? You can't undo that paint blend. I don't know if that makes sense in that analogy. If anyone has a toddler with different colors of paint, you can't, once it's all brown mush, you can't go back and separate the colors. And that's sort of what they're asking firms to do, to be able to keep track of, which is a huge intense cost to be able to figure out.
This gets more and more Brexity-ish.
Well, so the point about origin though is important because it doesn't just apply in the context of USMCA. So if we assume that the reciprocal tariffs at the higher rates are applied at some point, so you have differential tariffs applied to different countries. So the UK gets 10%, the EU gets 20%, Switzerland gets 30 something, Vietnam gets 40 something, and the like. The question of where a product's from becomes increasingly important, and this brings you into an even worse space, rules of origin space, which is the non-preferential regime. Because what I've described so far as the preferential rules of origin, for most products at least you have a specific rule, whereas the non-preferential regime is based on usually on this thing called last substantive transformation, which is pretty vibes based in terms of determining where a product is from. And this is going, if the US really wants to enforce a world in which you have some really high tariffs on some countries and not on others in the same region, you have to clamp down on non-preferential rules of origin. So companies will have to be able to demonstrate that the product is from country with lower tariffs. So in the context of the European ecosystem, the UK rather than the EU. And this is going to put a whole new administrative burden on companies, just in terms of their normal trade. This isn't trading under preference. This isn't dealing with an FTA. This is just doing what they did normally. Whereas before they said, oh, it's from the UK and no one cared. Now that could become quite important.
So there's a load more paperwork at a minimum, even if you're avoiding the tariffs, just to prove that you can avoid.
Everyone says paperwork. It's more sort of administrative load. You know, as in the paper might be the same in that we could just write down and say where it's from. But you've had to, if you're actually asked to prove it, you then have to go back into your supply chain and present the evidence. And also, if you're US Customs, the easiest way to enforce this is actually to shift the burden of proof onto companies, where you just assume the higher rate unless someone can prove otherwise. I'm not suggesting they do this because it would be awful, but that's probably inevitably where it ends up, because it's the way you minimize risk from an import perspective.
And for Brexit watchers, I should say we're hurtling towards another deadline in UK-EU relations, which is to do with local content in electric vehicles, where I think the current situation is going to expire with higher local content rules soon. But just one more thing on the US specifically, because I want to turn to the global dimension. I mean, you said, Sam, that the US is a bit different to many cases. And one of the ways in which the US has always been magical is it seems that their economy grows whatever the hell they're doing and whoever the hell's in charge. They have this sort of magical growth tree. But the scale of the disruption here, this is going to play out in terms of the numbers in the US economy, isn't it? And soon? Or am I missing something? Is it so resilient, that economy, that it can sort of weather this? Or are you going to see real significant impacts in the near term? Monica, I'll start with you as a resident American.
Yeah, I think President Trump is going to test that thesis. And the reason I say that is, one, look at the reaction of the markets. In the past, the trade policy, yes, it played around the margins, but at the end of the day, we had a strong financial system, we had a strong growth engine. I mean, there were other ways in which you could see the economy growing. The markets do not like these actions. They will be inflationary, and it's coming in an environment post-COVID, post-pandemic disruptions where we're coming off of a high inflationary period. So this is going to be really tough for the American consumer to continue to be an engine of the economy. The other aspect here, which we haven't really talked about much, is just shaking the trust in the financial system, and the president's repeated criticisms of Jerome Powell and the independence of the central bank. That, again, the American financial system generally, we can debate 2008 and a few other moments in history, but generally there's been a lot of respect for the independence of the American financial system. If those attacks continue, if it continues to be questioned whether or not that's going to remain, then I think we are looking at some fundamental questions about the US economy that very well could play out in future growth or not.
The other thing too is, this comes back to California and your point, is that we're seeing pushback from California, actually. This hasn't been brought up, but one of the largest economies in the world, what we saw is Governor Newsom coming out and saying, we're going to reach out to different governments and we're going to negotiate with them to maintain our trade relations. And California has obviously brought one of those actions against the use of IEPA. So we're seeing a really interesting dynamic also between the federal and state relationship as well, while all this is playing out under executive discretion, which will have huge implications, I think, going forward.
Can I just make a slight correction to something I said earlier? So in terms of USMCA and automotives, the vehicles trading between the US, Mexico and Canada, if they qualify for USMCA, then the US content is zero rated. The non-US content still faces the 25% tariff. So there is a benefit. I mean, you mentioned I've done diagrams, but you can sort of work out that the aggregate tariff of a vehicle traded under USMCA is lower than 25%, but it's still not the 2.5% that it was before, depending, and it all depends on the value of US content within the vehicle, just to complicate things further, but to be accurate.
Thank you.
That's the added 232, right? The security.
Yeah, that's the 25%.
Yeah. Because they've said that the automobile sector is a security concern of the United States, they impose additional tariffs.
Okay. I suppose the big question is, does Trump care if it affects the domestic economy? Does he even care about public opinion? Does he care about the midterms? I mean, what motivates him strikes me as quite an interesting question. I mean, Monica, I suppose you again here. I mean,
yeah, I mean, as somebody who worked in the White House, I mean, the White House is constantly watching public opinion. And I think we have seen public opinion, Capitol Hill, that in any administration, the president's at the height of his power at the beginning of the administration. We saw that here. But we're starting to see cracks in that. And again, you saw Liberation Day announcements, you saw massive tariffs, and then you saw that walked back a few days later with the response of the markets, questions coming from Capitol Hill. I know in my current position, there's a lot of back channeling happening between Republicans on Capitol Hill and the White House as well. So this is being watched. I think it's a question of how patient is the American voter. A lot of that is going to depend on what this does to prices, but it's inconceivable to me that they will not be paying attention to this and that will not influence decision making ultimately.
okay, and your expectation is that where we are now is already going to start to have significant consequences. So even if things stay the
yes,
same.
I mean the uncertainty right now, I can't stress how damaging that could be over the longer term. Even if you think about the goal of U.S. manufacturing, companies are not going to invest in the United States in the current environment. So any factory that comes online is going to take minimum of 2 years. In pharmaceuticals, it's 5 to 10 years to do that kind of investment, that kind of regulatory clearance. When the president has put these tariffs on with the stroke of a pen with IEEPA, they can come off with the stroke of a pen. And so no business is going to undertake millions of dollars in capital investment based on the stroke of a pen that could be undone with the stroke of a pen. There has to be more certainty in that environment. So I don't think you're going to see the reinvigoration of the domestic industrial base in the way the president wants through this. That's one issue. Then you're going to see likely consumers pulling back as prices rise. That's going to have an impact on the economy. It's really questionable. And then we still have just the pause on the night they want to negotiate bespoke trade agreements with close to 100 countries. Any of us who have done trade agreements know that that's really not feasible to do bespoke trade agreements with this many countries in that short a period of time. So there's a lot of questions in terms of what is going to happen at the end. Are we going to see these tariffs go on? Again, for companies, where do you go that's safe? If you were looking to move out of China, a lot of companies moved supply chains to Southeast Asia, but Southeast Asia was amongst the hardest hit regions. So there's really, I think companies that right now are frozen because they don't know where to go. They don't know where is safe. And I think there's going to be a lot of wait and see to see how the whole list shakes out.
Okay, I should just go on, Mona.
I was going to say Japan's a really interesting example of what Monica just said, because the Japanese delegation just came to Washington to talk to them about a potential trade agreement. And of course, Japan already negotiated with the United States when they were negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership under the Obama administration. So you have a repeat of sort of some of the issues that had already come up and had already been negotiated extensively, that on the very first day of Trump 1.0 administration, they exited out of the TPP, out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it's a question then, you saw, and there was some really excellent reporting that went on over the weekend of this, of sort of what exactly, the Japanese delegation asking, what exactly is it to the Trump administration that you want? What can we negotiate, or where do we begin? And it didn't seem clear to me that there is an answer to that question, which makes it very difficult to understand where to negotiate and what to do. And are there sort of existing concerns? And how do you make an environment from uncertainty to stable enough to have the firms invest, to what Monica just spoke about?
Just for those of you thinking about bespoke trade deals, I can reassure you that Sam, in his newsletter today, provides a text for such trade deals, which people can just copy and paste and add the name of their country, and then everything will be sorted out. But I mean, the most popular question on Slido is a nightmare. I'm going to ask you it because it's the most popular question, but I mean, I don't know who to pick on. It says, what happens in January 2029? Can we imagine a post-Trump US trade policy? And if I can rephrase that, things have changed forever, haven't they, now because of this?
So I think you have to work on the assumption, even if you get a reversal or some sort of reversal and Democrats win and you sort of go a bit more Biden, where you keep a load of the tariffs, but you're a bit nicer to your friends. And you know, sorry, this is a very European perspective of what Biden did, which maybe is not shared by Monica, but that's sort of how it's viewed in Europe. You know, even if you've done that, you've got to think, well, they've crossed the Rubicon, right? So it could happen again. So you've got to plan on the basis that a Trump-like insurgency is just around the corner, and that actually all of the international constraints, domestic legal constraints, don't work. So on that basis, on a 5 to 10 year basis, if you're a country in Europe, say, you've got to think, okay, we can't, it's settled down a bit, but it could come back again. And if you're being strategic, you go, okay, so where does it really matter that we can't rely on the US anymore? And that's where you start thinking about defense. That's where you start thinking about other areas that are security adjacent, where you think, okay, we can't decouple from the US now, but could we over 10 years, or could we at least minimize our reliance? And this is where I think there's a big tension in the discussions now between Europeans in the US, where I've been in rooms where you have all of the Americans essentially saying, Europe, you need to do more on China. You need to think about decoupling and de-risking. And all the Europeans in the room are going, well, at the moment, we're thinking about de-risking from you.
Yeah.
and it's just so I think this intervention by Trump now leaves its mark. And actually, to Monica's point earlier, you can't plan because of the different uncertainty. I think you can to a degree, in that you sort of think, well, this could happen again, and yeah, he might turn things off again. So are there ways in which I can remove that uncertainty entirely? And the two options I can see is you stop selling anything to the US, or you sell stuff to people in the US from as near as possible, building on from within the US. And that's not necessarily a good outcome for the world, but it does at least provide you a degree of insulation.
So it's a whole new meaning of friendshoring, where the US isn't seen as a friend anymore, I suppose, which is strange. Okay, just move on a bit, because I realize I've chaired this badly and we're running out of time and there's a load to do. Let's be properly sort of Europe and UK focused. I mean, firstly, Sarah, one of the things that hasn't been talked about enough, and I'm slightly curious as to whether this impacts on it at all, is services trade. Because while we've had this huge, great sort of fandango about goods, I mean, Trump isn't talking about services, but does this impact on services trade at all? And if so, how?
So the barriers to trade in services are different to what they are in goods. It's not about showing, whether you made your car in Germany. It's about whether it's a much more kind of set of regulatory questions. That's a bit of an advert for an upcoming lunch hour on regulation by
Indeed.
UKICE.
Well played. Actually, while we're at it, Monica's got a fantastic blog on our site out today.
Exactly.
So joined up.
Absolutely. So it's really about whether your regulations on who counts as a lawyer or who counts as an architect are aligned, and whether that allows you to kind of sell your architectural services, cross border. I do think that a services, I mean, I work on services, and it's really interesting that the whole picture really is about visible trade, and the kind of invisibles have been kind of, as you say, largely overlooked. I do think they are in play in the background a little bit, though. So I think one of the reasons why the UK, at least initially, seemed to be being treated quite favourably, and then that looked rather less favourable. And, there's been all these discussions about whether it's around Scottish golf courses or visits to Buckingham Palace. But I think one of them is a reflection of the UK economy. So at one level, the UK economy, like Canada, is really open and trade intensive. But the UK is trade intensive with the US much more so in services than in goods. So if the US's concern is around a goods trade deficit, the UK isn't your kind of number one kind of problematic trading partner because of our dominance in services. There's a couple of caveats, though. I think one is that there are quite high growth areas of economic activity that don't neatly fall into either goods or services. So things like, financing of large kind of aerospace ventures, for example, is a set of activities that the UK is quite good at, but isn't entirely separate from goods. But nevertheless, I do think the UK's open services trade means that it's affected in a particular way, which is slightly different to some of its European counterparts. Germany would be the kind of obvious example. That being said, I think it's really important. There's actually a great UKICE blog by David Bailey called Carmageddon, where he looks at the impacts of this on the UK car industry. And I think what's really important there is that the impacts are not uniform across the UK. It depends on what parts of the UK focus on sectors which are in scope for Trump tariffs. And if you look at UK automotive, it's really heavily concentrated, and its supply chains are concentrated in the West Midlands. And so that means the implications in terms of a slight delay to the UK's trade and industrial strategies matter particularly for particular parts of the UK. And I think that's a really important point that sometimes gets missed when we kind of talk at this macro level about kind of UK-US trade. Actually, it's particular places, particular supply chains that through which this is being played out.
I'd also just say on services that they are part of the conversation, not insofar as how Trump determines whether a country is sort of good or bad based on his sort of general equation, which only focuses on goods deficits. But once he starts listing grievances, once he starts saying, well, the Europeans are nasty to us because of X, Y, Z, then digital regulations on there, digital services taxes are on there. Across the world, if you just look at the list for different countries, you've got how do they sort of approach data localization? How do they? So services are very much in play from a, are other countries being mean to our companies perspective? But in terms of, sort of actually trying to say, well, we've got a goods trade surplus, but actually we've got a services deficit. No, of course he doesn't care about that. But yeah, they're part of the conversation. I don't think he views trade in the sort of, trade to him is just our country's good being nice to us or not. From an aggressive perspective, it doesn't really matter. He doesn't differentiate between goods and services.
I think sorry.
No, go on.
I was going to say, I think there's another impact with respect to services too, in respect to education. I mean, I'm the one coming from a university here, and I think in terms of how this will impact both research and innovation in universities within the United States, and the impact that will have on either researchers leaving the United States, they've lost their grants for their research and they're moving to other institutions, and also in terms of students and where they're coming from, and whether there is a concern about their ability to go and study in the United States, and if they then feel that they can't or are feeling insecure about doing so, they will go abroad, and that will also have an impact on services too.
And of course, there's a very interesting fight going on between the Home Office and the Department of Education here about student visas and the like, and the ability to attract US talent is an interesting part of that conversation now. But just to be utterly parochial, I want to focus a little bit on the UK to end up with. Keir Starmer repeats ad nauseam that he is not going to choose between the United States and Europe. It seems to me that whilst that's probably the right thing for a UK Prime Minister to say, it's going to be virtually impossible to deliver because of some of the trade-offs involved, whether it's the direct trade-offs of, agricultural standards or whatever it is, or whether it's because if we're seen to be cleaving too closely to the US on issues of AI and technology, that will affect perceptions in Europe in what is seen as a kind of, us or them kind of situation. Am I being too cynical here? Go on, Sam, disagree.
Well, I disagree. I think I disagree with you slightly on this. Insofar as
use Sam's agreement, his one pager, he's done.
Yeah, right. In terms of direct binary choices, the only one that's really in play is on what you mentioned, agricultural standards, where the UK wants to do a veterinary agreement with the EU, which will require it binding itself probably to the EU sanitary and phytosanitary regime in respect of both domestic application and in respect of third country imports. The US wants the UK to change its veterinary standards because currently it leads to us not importing a load of US food. So that's a binary choice. UK does not want to do what the Trump wants on this, not necessarily even because of the EU relationship, but because it would be really unpopular domestically. British people have quite French sensibilities when it comes to food. It turns out, this is the legacy of the TTIP negotiations. We've sort of tested this many times. We sort of know they don't like people talking about GM and hormone treated beef. So UK has a choice there, and I think it will go towards the EU. And in the context of the discussions with the US, it's then offering tariff reductions. It's not talking about digital services tax. Again, this is one that could create some problems for other countries in Europe. So France, Italy, Austria, Spain. Did I make up Spain? I made up one of them. Who has digital service? No, whether they have digital services taxes. If the UK changes it or gets rid of it, it sets an unhelpful precedent. But I think even at the political level, the context isn't that you've got a unified EU that all is sort of approaching Trump in one way. You've got lots of member states that are taking completely different approaches. You've got Meloni, who has a good relationship with Vance versus Macron. So I think there is the possibility of the political relationship being tested if the UK is seen to be sucking up to Trump and getting treated nicely in return, whereas the EU is getting slammed. But I think we can overstate this. I think it's still entirely possible that the UK runs parallel tracks where we deepen the relationship slightly with the EU. And let's not overstate what we're trying to do. It is just slightly. And at the same time, discuss things with Trump and try and work out what it is we can do so that we get some of the tariffs reduced, if not removed. So, yeah, I think it's slightly overstated. I think the bigger binary for most countries, because the US is actually going to put this to the test, is us or China. And that will play out in the UK discussion as well, where the UK is a G7 outlier in terms of, for example, tariffs on electric vehicles.
Yeah. But there I was very struck, actually, and slightly surprised that Rachel Reeves went to Beijing the week before the inauguration. Where I sort of thought, well, we don't know what Trump's going to say or do on his first day in office. This strikes me as quite a gamble. And you think we will be forced, and Europe will be forced to make some difficult choices about China and face some direct trade-offs with the United States?
They'll be pushed on Europe. It depends where it sits in the hierarchy of things the US ends up deciding it wants from Europe. But I mean, it's been openly raised with the UK on multiple occasions, the question of, well, why don't you have tariffs on electric vehicles? Whereas the EU does, Canada does, Japan doesn't, but don't buy any anyway. But so there is that question there, and it's being raised in the question of forced labor, for example, where the US has rules related to the province of Xinjiang, the EU has its forced labor regulation. So these questions get asked. It's then a question of prioritization. If that gets put above the UK committing to spend 40 billion on US defense equipment, there are other things you can offer that might come into play.
I'm constantly interrupting you.
No, all I was going to say, man, was just Sam. That's not exactly de-risking, is it? Given
no, I'm not saying the UK will do that, but there's there are other things you can do. I mean, for example, the Buckingham Palace trip seems to be landing well. So at the softer end, I would also propose potentially demolishing the wind farm, spoiling the view from his golf course in Aberdeen. Given that whenever he talks about trade tariffs, he seems to go on a little diversion, start talking about wind farms and how they kill whales. So there are other things you can do, but China is definitely part of the conversation.
Sorry, Mona.
I was just going to say that there are some things, though, that the UK needs to focus on in terms of trade diversion and what this means for where goods end up being redistributed, owing to, for example, if countries no longer want to sell things into the US, or if the US now has products that they are no longer selling to a particular jurisdiction, whether they will get dumped in the UK markets. And so this is a really important calculus in sort of forecasting of where to go, because the UK may not have as much leverage in sort of the EU market and the US market and sort of navigating the relationship with China if everything is sort of avalanche and being thrown into what is already a very delicate or precarious situation owing to Brexit. So that's something that they have to be very careful with and negotiate both with the United States, but also with Europe and with China. And in addition to that, you have Europe sort of slowly changing their position with respect to, for example, electric cars, where you saw at least, I don't know, it must have been 6-7 months ago now, questions of Europe sort of having tech transfer requirements with China if there was going to be Chinese investment within Europe. But to Sam's point, this is not, there is sort of heterogeneity across the different EU member states. But at the same time, it's important, I think, for the audience to know that Europe is in a really interesting place where there's actually much more centralization of economic security within the Commission, within the Central European competence, bridging sort of what would be a security issue or an economic issue in the domain of what the member states can actually independently do. And with respect to China as well. And so this also is a really different dynamic for the UK as well.
Okay. Just Sam, one specific question that's been bothering me recently. Sorry about this. Why aren't our roads submerged under Chinese electric vehicles? We don't. I mean, given that we don't have tariffs, I mean, and you hear about some countries where they're sort of dominating the market.
Well, we do
Why?
have a tariff. I mean, there's still a 10% tariff. So just
Right.
to be clear, because that's the MFN rate. But why aren't they submitted? I mean, things take time. There's consumer preference. You know, you can't sort of force, as this is actually Trump's big issue with Europe in general on cars, which is you can't force Europeans to buy loads of big American cars because they don't want to. There's a consumer preference issue. So, you know, it takes time to penetrate a market. But I mean, this is completely anecdotal. But I would notice that, yes, while you don't necessarily see loads of Chinese brand EVs on the roads in London right now, you're starting to see more of them. A BYD showroom just opened at the end of my street.
Oh,
you know,
interesting.
this is you know, we're talking to academics now, so everyone's going to be shaking their heads, sort of saying, you know,
I love this.
this isn't real research, but you start to notice, and the thing I'd say in the UK as well is that we don't necessarily have a home brand at that price point. So we're quite, you know, we'll buy from anywhere if the car's good enough and it's cheap enough. So I think you could start to see the market share increase quite quickly over time, particularly given the UK will be probably the most open remaining G7 market, given the tariffs elsewhere and Japan's lack of interest.
Okay, well, on that extremely perceptive bit of empirical observation, we're going to have to end, I'm afraid, because it's now 2 o'clock. But thank you to Monica, to Mona, to Sam, and to Sarah, and to all of you for joining in. Do check out Monica's blog on our website. The 4 of you, I hope we can have you back at future events, because let's face it, this story is going to run and run and run, so we can update it maybe in a few months' time. But for the moment, thanks all very much indeed, and see you again soon. Take care.